What's up, everybody? Welcome back. This will be my third and final installment of my introduction to World War I notes. Now, you will have more notes on the war, but this kind of concludes like the opening segment of the war and getting everything going. Also, on a totally unrelated side note, just so you know that I wasn't making up how much I really like Teddy Roosevelt, check this out. I forgot to show it when I was doing the Teddy Roosevelt lectures, but there's Teddy Roosevelt on safari riding a T-Rex with a machine gun. Thought you guys might appreciate it. So I wasn't making that up. I am a big TR fan. All right, moving on to World War I stuff. So where we had left off last time, the last thing you should have put in your notes if you're following along and doing that like I recommend was we kind of left off on trenches. Now, why the heck did they use trenches? Why would you dig holes and try to fight a war, fight an enemy from there? It doesn't seem like you're getting very far if you're just digging in and entrenching in, and it makes it really hard to break through. It really was not intended. When the war broke out, nobody on any side expected it to be a trench war. It was really out of necessity. Nobody had used machine guns and heavy artillery out in combat up to this point, and it totally rewrites and changes the rules of warfare. Now, prior to World War I, you go to basically every conflict before this for 1,000, 2,000 years, almost always, there's exceptions, but almost always the side with the best heavy cavalry, like the guys that are on horseback, would usually win the day. But think most battles and most wars before that would last one day, usually, maybe 2 or 3 days for a really long battle. And before the end, you got the two armies meeting on the field, shooting at each other, and then eventually one side sweeps around with their cavalry, catches the other side off guard, and that's usually the end of the battle. Well, World War I didn't play out like that. You have, for one, bigger numbers than ever before. These massive ground armies that are squaring off and colliding with each other. And then with these new modern weapons, when you try to charge cavalry, like hundreds of guys on horseback into entrenched positions with machine guns and maybe a couple mortars and some artillery shells, how do you think that goes? Not very good. Those guys get mowed down. They just get wiped out with this new firepower. So today, after you finish this video, you'll watch a scene I put in from War Horse. It's about a 3-minute scene, but I've never seen it put on film before. Kind of a better depiction of how the kind of opening months of World War I played out, and just like exactly what I'm talking about here, where it's like old school war tactics meet new war technology, and you can see, when quite a few battles played out exactly how you'll see in that War Horse scene, why trenches started to become necessary. So with cavalry not really having much of an impact anymore, because machine guns just cut them down when they go to make these charges, both sides are under fire and they're getting hit from heavy mortars and these big guns, the artillery. So you need the best possible defenses to dig down into the earth and get yourself entrenched so you don't get hit by bullets or the shrapnel that's flying all around. All right, moving on a little bit. At the beginning of the war, well, I guess that last photo I was showing you is kind of how the trenches started in early 1914. Really, they weren't much of trenches at all. They were just kind of like foxholes that had got dug out wider, and guys would get down in those to take cover from the enemy. But as it drug on and on and on for months and months, and then eventually years, each side ends up beefing up their trenches and making them look better. So this is a trench, I think, from about maybe 1915 or so in the British part of the lines. So the British and French are fighting together against the Germans. And we're talking about the Western Front of World War I, where America will eventually join in. Typically, the British trenches look kind of like this once the war is up and running, and the French ones do too. Now think, the Germans had the initial advantage. They had pushed into French territory. The Germans throughout the whole war, a key point that I'd have you put down right after the notes part, the Germans typically had better trenches. They were designed better and they were on higher ground. Now, why is that? It's because they had pushed into French territory and taken some really key French factories. So they didn't feel the pressure to go on the offensive quite as much either, and they're outnumbered. They feel like if they can just hold on and wait it out, that might be their best strategy for now. Whereas the British and French have lost territory. They need to get that French land back. So they always are telling their soldiers, we're not staying in these trenches very long. The next big attack is going to break through and we're going to punch the German lines. So their trenches, they often wouldn't give up any more ground because they were already pushed so far back. So their soldiers are often in these wet, mucky trenches that are poorly designed, where the Germans were kind of okay with more of a defensive strategy and then beefed up their trenches a little better. I'll show you eventually some examples of both. Now, depending at where you are at on the line would totally depend on what your trenches and fortifications look like. If you were in the middle part of France on all the way down to like the Swiss Alps where it starts to get really mountainous, you probably had trenches dug into the ground like those last ones I showed you. That's most of the line. But if you get far up to the north where you start getting close to the English Channel, the trenches that run through Belgium, they looked kind of like this. I mean, check out that photo. I'll move my picture a little bit. It's just a big muck pit. Now, those countries are called the Low Countries because they're very close to sea level. So if you start digging down just even a foot or two, you're going to hit mucky water. Anyway, it's just a big soupy mess. And there are horrific stories. If you read about the Battle of, I believe it's Ypres and Passchendaele, where the British were fighting on the northern part of the line, you hear stories. This photo is from Passchendaele, a little town in Belgium, where guys would fall off of those planks, and sometimes soldiers would watch one of their buddies fall into the water and basically just disappear like quicksand. And if they kicked and struggled, usually that would just dig you in deeper. There are stories of guys that would be stuck in this quicksand and they couldn't get themselves out of the muck. They were too far down, and their buddies couldn't get like poles or a gun or anything for them to hold on to it to get him out. And that guy would just be sitting there sometimes for a day or two, and you'd watch him slowly disappear, and he's still alive. And then eventually you come back one day and he's just gone. He's sunk into the muck and he's never going to be seen from again. Rotten conditions. So, if you were going to be a soldier in the trenches, boy, you'd hope you weren't up on the northern part of the line, because that was really soupy and mucky and probably some of the worst conditions I've ever heard soldiers fighting in any war. So rotten up north where it's really low and mucky. Oops, I went too far there. Eventually you get this system. Now I want you to draw this out in your notes. Usually I just have you write things down. This is one time where I'm going to have you draw out a diagram. So you can take a little chunk, a block of your notes, and then you're going to draw like the trenches, what the trenches look like. You have, and you're kind of seeing it from one side here. I'll move my face a little bit. So the area in between the trenches is called no man's land. I'm coming back to this slide, but this is kind of what no man's land looked like. For no man's land, write that in too, like a little side note. No man's land was usually roughly around 100 yards, maybe 200 yards. Think about a little bit more than a football field, where you have these two lines of trenches that go for 500 miles with about 100 to 200 yards of distance or so in between them. The area in between the trenches is called no man's land because essentially no man could live out there. It's all been shot up. There've been countless charges on both sides trying to break through the lines. There's dead bodies everywhere. The trees that would have been there in the farm country has all been shelled out by heavy artillery. You'd have craters. Some photos of no man's land, it almost looks like a picture of the moon or something. And the only thing that gives it away is you have these old blown out trees that look like toothpicks coming out of the ground, and you often see dead bodies all over the place. So no man's land is that area in between the trenches. Now going back to my other diagram. Why is that not going? There we go. You'd have no man's land as that area in between the trenches. And then you might say, like, often kids get confused and they're like, why couldn't you just put a lot of guys in one spot in the line and go break through and overrun the enemy trenches, and then you have a mobile offensive and you could get your guys on horseback riding and you've turned their line, you've broken through the German lines, or vice versa, breaking through the British and French lines. Well, the reason that became basically an impossibility for most of the war was both sides were aware that you can break through that front line of trenches. That's something that happened quite a bit. So to protect against that, so it wasn't an all-out disaster anytime the enemy punched through your first line of trenches, they typically, everywhere along the front, they would dig a tier of 3 trenches. So you'd kind of draw that into your notes, that you'd have trenches like layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. If your front line gets taken, so say this is over here, maybe the German side, for example, and here are the French and the British, and they're charging across, and they break into that first line of trenches and kill the Germans there. Well, some of the Germans have retreated back to that second trench line, Other Germans have been called up as reinforcements. The artillery is going to be shelling that area, so it makes it almost impossible to keep moving and go for too long, like when you're not like fortified in and in your trench position. And it makes it almost impossible. So then each side, if you do break through the first line of trenches, it just pushes the battlefield back a couple hundred yards. And then they start digging. Now you've lost your first line and you have lines 2 and 3. So you start digging a new third line. So you have this cushion kind of on both sides, and it's like a rubber band. You can stretch it and push it, but man, you never can get quite past the whole tier of 3 trenches. And then notice, like behind the third line of trenches, you have your really expensive equipment, these high powered artillery. That can shoot 5, 10, sometimes 20, 30 miles away with decent accuracy. Those are back there. So like if they do start breaking through and have a big offensive, you're going to have time to get your artillery out of there so the enemy doesn't capture it. And the whole time you're going to be shooting at the enemy too. So you'll have these battles in World War I where tens, 20s, hundreds of thousands of guys will die in a massive offensive. And like, what do they get for it? They end up picking up like a couple hundred yards, maybe a mile or two at best. And then the trench lines kind of space out and it readjusts and everything just goes back to how it was. So that's the tragedy of World War I on both sides, the British and French and the German side. Both sides, the leadership did horrible charges where they just stuck to these old tactics of just like, we're going to charge through and do it the old fashioned way and be tough. And they would get their men slaughtered. They just get thrown out into that meat grinder of machine gun and heavy artillery. And the losses became catastrophic on both sides. And the casualties were like nothing that had ever been seen before in warfare. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a decent understanding of how the trenches were set up. Here we go. Unintended consequences of having guys out in trenches in these fortified positions for extended periods of time. Well, guess what? When you dig a hole that's 6, maybe 10 feet in the ground and you're down there in the dirt, it gets, even if you aren't up in the northern part of the line in the Low Countries, even down in the middle of France, it's going to start getting soupy and mucky. That's how you would dig a well. You'd keep digging further down and eventually you hit the water table. Also, anytime it rains or snows, you get all that precipitation going down to the lowest point and it would collect up and pool in these trenches. So you have guys on both sides, but especially the Allied side, because the German trenches were a little bit higher up and they kept them a little drier, where these guys would be out there with no changes of clothes. There are certain guys that were fighting in the war in 1914 and 3, 4, 5 years later, they're still wearing the exact same uniform that they showed up with 4 or 5 years ago. Think about that. You don't have changes of clothes. You get a little stinky out there. Most soldiers had 2 pair of socks, and like over time, they might issue you more. But good luck keeping your socks and boots dry if it's like the rainy season and you're getting rain a couple times a week and you're stuck out there for sometimes weeks and weeks and months on end out in these trenches. Guys start to lose their mind too. So you can put in trench foot. That's when your foot gets too wet for too long. You get this fungus, like a very severe form of athlete's foot, building up on your skin, and eventually it just starts to rot it away. So the images I'm showing you here, that's very bad trench foot that's progressed for a while. Most guys didn't get it that bad, but if you didn't get it taken care of in the earlier phases, this could happen to you, and your feet could literally just, like your toes just rot right off your body. Any soldier that has it progressed this far is basically worthless as a soldier now because they're not going to be able to march and be mobile anymore. So armies catch on to this and they start issuing their guys more dry socks. And then the other thing, because being out in these trenches under enemy fire for weeks and weeks and sometimes months on end, it starts to make people go insane. Another thing that I don't have a point on for this slide, but you should write it in, they called it shell shock. Shell shock is when you've just hit your breaking point. And you can find some old videos of these guys, World War I veterans that had severe shell shock where they shake uncontrollably. They can't answer questions. I mean, they've lost their mind. They hit their breaking point. All humans have a breaking point. Now, some people are really, really tough, like a Teddy Roosevelt kind of guy. Other people have their breaking point, that threshold really low, and it only takes a little bit for them to snap. But all humans have it somewhere. And all the armies at first, when they're guys that have been out there and they told them they were going to be home by Christmas, like in a couple months, and now It's 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years later, and they've been stuck out in these trenches. At first, when guys started to break and snap with shell shock, they thought they were just being cowards. They blamed them for that. And they actually, some of the armies, there's accounts where they shot their own guys for cowardice. But then it started happening to enough guys that they realized there's just too much stress. Something else is happening here. Because any war before World War I, usually, even if the war lasted years, when you would have a battle, usually the battle was a day, 2, 3 days. Maybe they're out there fighting for a week or two, but that was usually about it. You'd go have the battle, and then one side would win, and that's it. Story's over. For World War I, it didn't play out that way. You have these extended trench lines, and nobody ever gets that win. And both armies stay out in the field for years and years. Soldiers have never experienced anything like this before. This is uncharted ground, and it takes a major toll on these soldiers' bodies and even more so on their minds. So have that in there. I don't really care how you account for that, but that's some crucial information that you would want to know and probably jot down some way in your notes. All right. Another unintended consequence of trench warfare is the rats. There are rats, I guess, everywhere, because rats, you know what I mean? They work really good with humans. They're one of those species that does well around civilization. Coyotes do, raccoons do, but rats, they especially do and are adaptable. There's rats everywhere on every continent, essentially. Anywhere where people live, there's going to be some rats. Well, what do rats eat? They usually eat garbage and junk and things humans throw out. Well, in the case of World War I, think of what no man's land looks like. There's dead bodies strewn everywhere, and you can't go get your buddy that died in the battle yesterday, because if you go out there in no man's land and try to grab his body and pull it off, what's going to happen to you? The enemy is shooting at you, and you might end up there dead. So there's places on the front where sometimes they would call a truce, or at night they would go up there and try to get their dead buddies out of there and retrieve bodies. But most of the time they just sat out there and rotted. They'd get green, they'd bloat up, the bacteria's eating them. And then of course the rats move in too, because now they have a never ending supply of food. There's human bodies everywhere, and the rats eat meat. They're carnivores too. So they would live off the dead humans. And then at night, when the guys are out there and they don't go back to barracks, you're out there as a soldier. Eventually, they found out the guys would go crazy if you just leave them out there forever. So most of the army started doing like a 2-week rotation. So you'd go up to the front for 2 weeks, and then you'd get a week or 2 weeks off, and you'd get pulled off of the front to kind of recharge your mental batteries. Well, when you're up there on the front line duty, you're there 24/7. And at night, I guess, when you go to sleep, rats are nocturnal, and there's all kinds of stories of guys just sleeping there and having rats crawl all over them, or rats would come up and bite them at night thinking they're a dead body. This made guys go insane too. I mean, think about that. Who wants vermin crawling all over them at night? It gives you the creepy crawlies just thinking about it. Now, soldiers they would try to kill the rats. They put poison out. They'd stab them with their bayonets. Sometimes they'd shoot them. But it's just a never ending, no matter what you did, you couldn't really get those rat numbers down. And they didn't come down until the war finally ended. All right, next up. So where does America fit into all of this? Move myself over to the side a little bit. Very key thing for you to have into today's notes. America's neutrality. This war breaks out, and I think this is kind of a popular opinion even today. It's kind of gained traction. President Trump's pretty big on this. On the other side of the aisle, Bernie Sanders is a big champion of this kind of foreign policy. It's that America should be essentially neutral, that we don't want to be the policeman of the world. The fancier way of saying it at the time, so this is not on the slide, but I'd like you to write this in there. It was known as isolationism. So to isolate yourself, that means you're off by yourself. Isolationism is, hey, America, we're over here in North America. We got neighbors, Mexico and Canada, and we're pretty peaceful with them and got the situation under control. That basically this big war breaking out over in Europe is not our problem. We don't want to go over there and join up. We don't want American boys dying. We don't care that Serbia was getting invaded or that Belgium's neutrality, was violated by the Germans. Not really our problems. No, American people, they don't care about that. It doesn't affect their day-to-day lives. Now, there were people in America that thought we should get into the fight. Teddy Roosevelt, had he won that election of 1912 that he almost did, but he didn't pull it off as a third party candidate. If Roosevelt had been president, I think history would have played out differently. America probably would have gotten in the war sooner because Roosevelt thought America, we needed to defend freedom and democracy, and that the Germans were a dictatorship, and he wanted us in there. He was very critical of the guy that beat him in the election, Woodrow Wilson. But Roosevelt didn't win. Woodrow Wilson did. And Wilson is a shrewd politician. And he looks and like basically 2/3 of Americans, maybe a little more early on, wanted the British and French to win. But about a third of Americans were from German or Austrian Central European descent. And many of them kind of wanted to see the Central Powers win. So you have a rift in America where there's not even a clear consensus who we want to win this fight. So Wilson looks at it and says, either way I jump into this conflict, I'm going to basically piss off a lot of Americans. And he still wants to win re-election. So that's probably a smart decision on his part. And then I think furthermore, he probably looked at it and truly believed, this isn't our fight. We have no dog in this fight. Let's just stay out of it. Isolationism. That's the policy, the term he used for the policy he wanted. Essentially, it means America's going to be neutral. We don't want to get involved either way. We kind of take the position that we're going to sell money and profit from this, and we'll sell weapons and food and whatever you need. We'll sell it to both sides. America's not fighting in this. We're a neutral bystander. Secretly, most Americans and our president and military leadership kind of wanted the Allies to win. We were a little bit closer with the British and French, but not so much that we were ready to go and join up in the war at this point. Now, eventually America does. This next week, we're going to start getting into that whole story and how over a couple-year period, American neutrality weakened, and we end up finding ourselves in this fight. All right. See ya. Have a good weekend.